So now we should ask, what determines whether a supply curve is more or less elastic? And the key thing to understand about this is that it's about the costs of expanding and contracting production. So if it's really cheap to expand production, then you'll have a more elastic supply curve. If it's very difficult to expand production, you'll have a less elastic supply curve. So there are ways that expanding production can become cheaper, and it's typically through having more options. So if there are more suppliers for the inputs that you use as a firm, then that will make elasticity the supply more elastic. If there are more firms that can expand production in different ways, that will make supply more elastic. If you're really stuck in one specific way of producing things, that will make supply more inelastic. So we can look at the graph and actually see this on here. So if we start out at this initial equilibrium and we want to expand production, let's say out to here. So if we want to do that, what that means is that on this more elastic supply curve, the marginal cost will only go up that much. But on the less elastic supply curve, the marginal cost will increase by a lot. So here, this is a cheaper expansion of production and a more expensive expansion of production. So this one would be a case where we don't have a lot of firms and they're all getting their inputs from the same sources and they're all using the same production methods so that they're all hiring the same workers, so that if they want to expand production, they have to think about how to do things in a new way. And that's really expensive and it takes time to do. Whereas over here, you could have one firm that's using a lot of machines to produce things and another firm that's using a lot of highly skilled workers, and they may be using different inputs. Maybe some are using plastic, some are using metal. And so it's cheaper for them to expand production because they have so many different ways to do it. So that's the main idea about how we differentiate high and low elasticities. The other thing is about the time period over which we have to expand production. So it's cheaper to expand production over a longer period of time than over a shorter period of time. So this would be like a short run elasticity, and this could be a long run supply curve or elasticity of the supply curve. So over a short period of time, it's very expensive to expand production. So imagine a farmer that wants to switch to producing cabbage, who hasn't been producing cabbage before. Well, they can't suddenly have a bunch of fully grown cabbage plants. I have never grown cabbage, so I'm not quite sure. Oh yeah, I know what it looks like. So they can't suddenly have a bunch of fully grown cabbage plants. It takes time and effort. If they want to grow them fast, then they probably have to use very expensive inputs to grow them faster than usual, and they have to take away resources from other things they're producing, and that's going to be very expensive. But if they have a longer time to respond to an increase in demand, it will be cheaper for them to learn to produce the cabbage because they will be able to use cheaper inputs, they will be able to switch over production more slowly, they won't degrade the quality of their land as much. So they can expand production a lot more easily over a longer time period. So this would be over a longer time period and over a shorter time period. Now, the one complication there is that it is not the case that supply curves become more elastic over time. That's not what we mean here. We mean that when there is a demand increase, that the response is more elastic over a longer time period. That's a very different thing than just saying all supply curves become flatter over time. They don't. Supply curves are like this. So one way to think of this would be like this. So let's draw another one out here. The typical way we think about this is to think about what happens when demand shifts. So we start out with a single, which I'll call short run, S for supply and SR for short run. Okay, so we start out with that, and then we get a new demand curve. Okay, demand increases, and we start out at point A, and then over a short time period we move to point B, and it's expensive for us to expand production. But then over time we start learning how to produce this at a lower cost. And it's like our short run supply curve actually moves out this way to a new short run supply curve. I know that what I'm saying is essentially that when demand shifts, that shifts supply. And this is one of the two cases where that kind of makes sense. But in general, that's not true. But it is true when we're thinking about the short run versus long run supply. Okay? And then what that means is that we essentially have this long run supply curve that goes through these 2 points. So here's point C where we end up. We start at A, we move up to B, and then we go to C. And the reason is that at first it's hard for us to expand production, but then we learn new ways to expand production, or we get to buy inputs from different sources, or we get to plant different things in our farm, or we get better at hiring people who work in our industry, anything like that. And the reason why that's a new short-run supply curve is that now that we're over here and we have expanded production, it would again be expensive for us to expand production out this way. So if demand shifted again, we would be in that same position that we were in before, where we would have to expensively expand production again. So if demand increased yet again, then we'd move up to point D, and then we'd move back to point E eventually. Okay, so this is kind of complicated. It's one of the harder concepts in this class. What I don't want you to do in general is to come to the conclusion that demand shifts supply. When you are thinking about the elasticities and the long run versus short run response, that is the only case where that will be okay. If you're just saying what happens when demand goes up, don't immediately say, well, supply is going to shift out here. So if the demand shifts up and that shift is permanent, then there will be this move from the short run to the long run here. But otherwise, it's not going to happen. So if we just shift up demand and there's some shock to demand and then it comes back down, we don't ever get this move to the long run. We just move up here and then move back. So if we go like this and then back, we'd go from A to B and back to A.